Welcome to the Mothers Leading the Way video series. Join us as we explore practical tips and tricks based on research to manage the many roles that working mothers play.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brigitte Vittrup. I am a professor of child development and also chair of the Department of Human Development, Family Studies, and Counseling at Texas Women's University. And I'm going to talk to you about child discipline, which is an inevitable part of parenting that we all engage in on a regular basis. And sometimes we probably feel that we get it right, but other times we feel like we get it wrong. And that's okay. And we're going to talk about that so that you don't feel a whole lot of guilt about what you have done or what you should have done. But I'm going to give you some tips on some effective discipline methods that might not work all the time, but some that research have shown to be more effective long term. And so I want to start by talking about really what is the purpose of child discipline. The origin of the word means to teach. So a lot of times people will hear discipline and immediately think punishment. And that might be part of it, but really the main goal is to teach appropriate behaviors, to guide students towards more appropriate behaviors, and to eliminate the unwanted behaviors. And so some of the more common discipline methods in the United States that you probably have used at various times, or at least some of them, things like timeout or grounding, if it's for older children, withdrawal of privileges, so taking a valued toy or activity away, yelling and scolding, although it might not be the best thing to do, we have all done it. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. Spanking is not as common anymore, but there's still a reasonable amount of parents that engage in that. We'll talk about that. Reasoning or diversion, and then also for the youngest children, distraction and negotiation. So, how we choose our parenting styles and our discipline techniques is oftentimes rooted in how we were parented ourselves. So there's sort of this transmission through the generations. And we're likely to repeat our parents' discipline methods with our own children. Even if you make a conscious decision not to engage in certain behaviors that you felt maybe your parents engaged in and you didn't think they were particularly effective. What happens sometimes is that if we're really stressed out or tired, where we just have this cognitive overload, I just can't deal with it, that often becomes the default that we then revert to. Because it's almost like an ingrained method, a default method that it actually takes conscious effort to overcome it. So if you have made a decision that I am never going to yell at my children, I was one of those. I made that decision. However, I grew up in a household where there was a considerable amount of yelling. And so if I'm tired, if I get frustrated, I have yelled at my children too. I don't think it's great. I don't want to yell at them, but it's one of those things that sometimes you are just so taxed cognitively, emotionally that you engage in that. And so it helps to understand, where is this coming from? Why am I doing it? And also to not feel so guilty about having engaged in some of these behaviors, because it really just, it's how we were brought up. It's sort of this ingrained method. Also, if you get certain education, maybe child development, knowledge, advice from pediatricians, families, and friends, those are other things that influence our parenting and child discipline behaviors. Now, if we look at specifically effective discipline, ideally it should be immediate, especially for the younger children, because that way the child will associate the discipline with the behavior. So things like wait until we get home if you're out in a public space, or wait until dad comes home, wait until mom comes home. It's not as effective due to the time lag, especially for the younger children. It's important that discipline is consistent, meaning that for certain types of behavior, the discipline method is the same each time. And then you want to make sure that it teaches a lesson, that it's not just a punishment, but that it actually teaches children what is the wrong behavior? Why is it wrong? And then also let them know what else to do. Because sometimes it's just based on children being young, not really able to handle their emotions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of how we can help guide children to better deal with their emotions so that they don't display some of those challenging behaviors. You want to make sure that you show respect for the child, which is also one of the reasons why things like yelling and spanking are not as effective, especially not long term, because the children get angry or emotional, and so they stop listening. Over time, they will stop caring. And then we definitely want to reward the good behavior because children want to please their parents and they're more likely to behave appropriately if they actually know that you pay attention to that and they get rewarded for that. And that's not to say that we're giving them candy or money and these tangible rewards, but sometimes even just positive attention. Um, Children might act up because they are craving attention. And so then any attention, even negative attention, is better than no attention at all. So let's start by talking about some effective child discipline methods. That doesn't mean that they're going to be effective all the time. It depends on you, it depends on the child, what mood you're in, what mood they're in, the context, what's going on in the background, who else is there. But at least some things that, when you're being consistent, it can be an effective discipline method. So timeout has been shown to be fairly effective for the younger children. And this is when you're removing the child from an interesting environment. So if you're saying, go to your room, and then the child goes to the room and they have all kinds of toys and electronics, then it doesn't really work. They have to be away from an interesting environment. And it is also recommended that you don't send them to a separate room where they're by themselves because it can lead to this feeling of isolation. It can be seen as a form of love withdrawal where you are removing them. They're by themselves, they're isolated, but you can have a separate timeout spot. And it actually works a lot better if it's the same spot every time. So they associate it with that. It could be a spot on the stairs, at the bottom of the stairs. It could be, by the wall, at a certain place where there's not interesting toys that they can play with, but where you can still also watch them to make sure that they don't hurt themselves and that they're not feeling too isolated. And the recommended time is 1 minute per age of the child. And so that means that for a 3-year-old, you would put them in timeout for 3 minutes. For a 5-year-old, you put them in timeout for 5 minutes. And it seems like, oh, that is not enough time. Some people will want to put kids in timeout for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. But really, for a child, for a 3-year-old, 3 minutes to sit in a boring spot is a long time. And so that really is the recommendation. And then it's really important to follow it up with reasoning and explanation that when they come out of timeout, that you talk to them and say, okay, this is why you were in timeout, because this is the behavior you engaged in, or this is what you said. This is how you treated the dog. This is how you treated me or another child. This is why it's not right to do that. And here's an appropriate reaction. So next time, let's try to do this instead. Because that way, over time, they are learning. Children are still learning. They need a lot of guidance to learn how to behave appropriately. And that's our role as parents. And so we want to talk to them about that. Another method that's quite effective is withdrawal of privileges. And so the important thing is to take away a highly privileged toy or activity. So it could be screen time, it could be a video game, it could be a favorite toy, favorite activity. And then the time is going to depend on the type of privilege and also the age of the child. One thing that I've found in my research is that children often, this is the one that really hits home. In one of my studies, the example we had was to lose TV privileges. This is several years back before all the kids had cell phones and iPads. So TV was a really valued privilege, and so many of them would say, that is a long time to be without TV. Like this would make an impact on me. And they actually, when they were asked, what would they prefer if they had a choice? Some of them would just say, I'd rather take a spanking because then you can just move on with your day and do whatever you want. But if I have to sit for several hours with no TV, I'd be so bored. And so this is the one that they remember. Um, so it could be highly effective. What's important is that it also is accompanied by reasoning and explanation so that they understand it. And especially for younger children, you have to be prepared to come up with other things to engage them with. And you might have to be prepared to listen to a whiny child who doesn't have their tablet or their favorite toy. And so whether you give them a book to read or they have homework or you have some chores they can work on, um, that will be important as well. Now, the big thing and what can be very effective on its own, as well as accompanying other types of discipline, is really that reasoning and explanation. Um, because again, the children have to be told why the behavior was wrong. And then we need to try to teach them alternative expressions or behaviors, what they can do instead. Because the key to eliminating misbehavior is really for the child to understand why they're being disciplined and also accept it. That doesn't mean they have to like it. They're not. But if they can at least accept it, and part of that happens when we can be very predictable that you engage in this behavior, this is the consequence. Because then they can start making a more conscious choice that, oh, I shouldn't do this because then this happens. Then I have my favorite toy taken away, or then I can't, you know, play on the iPad. And so what happens over time is that they end up internalizing those messages and then it becomes effective long term. I do want to mention a couple of ineffective discipline methods and kind of explain why they tend to be ineffective. And this is not to make anybody feel bad. Like I said, if we talk about yelling and scolding, I'm a professor of child development. I have studied everything. I know what's effective, what's not effective, what the research shows. But nonetheless, again, sometimes we just get to the point where we get frustrated and we engage in certain behaviors that are not effective. But the important thing is that you can acknowledge, okay, I've engaged in these behaviors that are not appropriate. Um, I'm not going to feel, guilty about it because I understand why I did it. And now I know that I can work on moving forward and engaging in more effective discipline methods. Yelling and scolding is so common. Most research shows that about 98% of parents yell at their children at some point. Um, One of the studies I conducted, we actually found that 35% of the parents had yelled at their infants who were less than a year old. And so clearly, that's not so much what the child is doing. That is a frustration on the part of the parent. And it is so common. Um, Parents are stressed out. There are just so many responsibilities when you're a parent. Um, you can only do so much. And so you have to give yourself grace for some of the things that you engage in as a parent that you may look back and say, yeah, that was probably not the best thing. But as long as it doesn't become something you're engaging in all the time, and just as we're guiding our children and we're helping them grow, we're growing ourselves as we learn new information. What happens sometimes is that some households are so loud because the parents are yelling, they're yelling at each other, they're yelling at their children, they're yelling up and down the stairs. And so it just becomes what we call a loud household. And so what happens is that that can lead to various negative consequences for children. It can lead to depression and low esteem. It can lead to aggression, and especially if with the yelling, there's also, demeaning and humiliating words being said, like, why are you so stupid? Why did you do that? And I don't like you. And things that sometimes might be said to children that just come out at the moment, but just being aware that especially Yelling is one thing. When it's combined with some of these harsh negative statements and words, that can really lead to children feeling humiliated, losing self-esteem, and potentially being more aggressive later on. And it can also lead to inappropriate social interactions between them and others. Um, and some children just become immune to it because there's just so much yelling going on that they just don't, they stop listening. And so it's just important to keep in mind that even if you have engaged in it, and even if you've made a conscious decision to, I am not going to do this, there may still be times that you do. But if you make a conscious decision, I'm really going to try not to do that, then you're already onto a better path. Spanking has decreased in frequency and how common it is in the United States over the past decade. So it is not as common anymore, but there are still parents that engage in it. It is legal in the United States. It has been banned in many countries around the world. But part of why parents engage in it too is because of its immediate effectiveness, because you get the child's attention right away and they stop the behavior right there. And so then it's almost rewarding for the parent because, hey, I know it works because they stop the behavior. However, if we look at long term, it's not very effective because the children will engage in the behavior again because it is a punishment, but it doesn't really teach the appropriate behavior. And so it can lead to a whole host of negative outcomes, including aggression, antisocial behavior, because they learn that some type of physical violence or because essentially that's what spanking is. It's a corporal punishment where you are hitting a child. It can lead to decreased moral internalization where they're not really getting the message that you intend for them to have because they get so emotional and so upset in the moment that they're not listening to anything that you're saying or they're not retaining it. And then there is a risk of abuse if it escalates. Not to say that if you've spanked your children that you're being abusive, but that let's say that is a normal, common method of parenting that you use, and then one day you're just so frustrated, you end up hitting a little harder. And so that's where the risk is there. And so that is also why currently 65 countries around the world have a complete ban. There's another 27 countries that have committed to enacting legislation for it. So now I want to talk about some age appropriate guidance and discipline for children at different ages. So if we look at the very young children, the toddlers, their thinking is not yet logical. And so they don't deliberately try to anger us, even though it might feel like that sometimes, they just don't. And before age 3, their memory is not very well developed. And so the rules have to be repeated often. So you might think, they should know this. I tell them all the time, don't pull the dog's tail, don't touch the stove, don't go into this closet. But again, their memory is just not quite fully developed yet. They do understand language well before they're able to actually produce language. So talking to them about the rules will also help them develop language skills. What's very important for the very young children is to be flexible and to be proactive. And so you want to anticipate the behavior and plan the environment for it. So if they keep going over to a potted plant and knocking it over and digging in the dirt, you might just have to move that plant. There's certain things, if you have a crystal vase that you don't want them to break, move it to where they can't reach it. What you want to do is model appropriate interactions. You want to really intervene with distractions and redirections. And so again, then for toddlers and preschoolers, you can start moving into things like timeout, just a momentary withdrawal of privileges. Sometimes you have to just ignore the behavior. This is for the younger children if they are throwing a temper tantrum, because sometimes you might be at the store and they're throwing a tantrum because they want candy and you're not going to give them the candy and then they throw a tantrum. And so if you give in, then they learn this behavior worked. So then it's better to ignore it. As long as they're safe, you can ignore it, or you can substitute their activity with another more appropriate activity. Then what happens in the preschool years is that they are in constant motion and activity. This is quite normal. Again, you want to plan the environment for it. They do have some improvements in memory and attention span. So they could begin to remember the rules better, but you still have to remind them. They still don't fully understand kind of cause and effect. So they're not fully able to predict the consequences of their behaviors. And again, reminders of the rules are important. Um, they're also still somewhat egocentric in thought, and that's really based on their cognitive development. That at the preschool level, they're just not able to fully understand another person's perspective. So again, we have to talk to them about it. They're having some problems with emotion regulation, totally normal at that age. And so, they aren't born knowing how to handle their emotions if they get frustrated, if they're tired, if they don't get what they want. So sometimes they might just kind of act out how they feel, not because they intentionally want to make you mad or want to hurt somebody, but they just don't know what else to do when they get tired and frustrated. So we want to help them find words for how they feel, help them verbally express their feelings to others, help guide them on how to make positive changes or how to make positive choices. So we want to make positive requests of them. We want to give them suggestions, create alternatives. Again, the redirection, paying attention to it when they are actually behaving well, when they're engaging in appropriate behaviors. And then things like timeout and momentary withdrawal of privileges. For the school age children, they become less egocentric in thought, so they're now better able to take other people's perspectives. So parents can actually explain the effects of their behaviors on others, and the child will understand. And so, again, that reasoning and explanation is important. So long as they have some simple reminders, they will be able to remember the rules. You can expect that they can remember the rules. We still want to be very concrete and specific with our directions and our expectations. Um, they start to become more influenced by their peers. Part of that is as they're starting to develop more independence, they spend more time away from home, at school. And so sometimes that can lead to inappropriate behavior. So we just want to remind them of our rules and of just kind of standard positive behaviors. But what happens also at this age is the emotions tend to move inwards. And so sometimes they can be less obvious to parents. And so we want to make sure that we're still checking in with the children in case they get overwhelmed. We want to make sure that they don't feel humiliated with any kind of discipline methods. But some of the things that you can engage in, timeout might become time to reflect on their behaviors. It could be withdrawal of privileges. It could be various logical consequences where the consequence is directly tied to their behavior. We still want to do the positive reinforcement, make sure that we pay attention to when they're behaving appropriately. And then again, being sensitive to their emotions and being responsive to that. And then we also want to try to guide the children in conflict resolution because there's going to be conflicts that they might have with their friends, peers at school, and then help them generate alternative solutions instead of, fighting or calling their peers, bad names, engaging in bullying, and really helping them. Like if they're having a problem at school or at home with somebody else, how can we talk about it? How can we respectfully express our emotions and try to come up with a solution that works for both parties? It's important. Part of child discipline is also setting limits for children. We want to be at all ages, we want to be specific and concrete, kind of keep it short. We don't want to use abstract words and phrases and saying, you need to do this soon, Well, what does that mean to a child? Whereas you can say, hey, you need to empty the dishwasher. I need you to do it within the next 30 minutes, or I need you to do it now, or do your homework and then you need to do it. Um, Things like knock it off or behave nicely. We want to be very concrete and specific in order to fully guide them. And then focusing on change. They've engaged in the bad behavior, and we do want to point that out, but then we don't want to wallow in it. We want to focus on the change, like what should they do instead? What's a better alternative? Um, and try to rely on persuasion instead of force. So we can give suggestions, we can be persuasive about acceptable behavior and alternative reactions and behaviors. Because if we start ordering them around and saying, you need to do this because I said so, it's a power-based way of speaking, and it's more likely to stir up anger and resentment. And it also doesn't quite lead to that long-term internalization of the message, because if you're just saying, it's because I said so, it doesn't really explain why. Try to only give a few limits or suggestions at a time, so they don't become overwhelmed, and also to make it more likely that they will remember it and be successful. And then always explain and give reasons. And then it's really important that parents and caregivers have a united front. So everybody should be on the same page. If these are the rules at the house, it can't be, one parent is okay with it, the other one is not. And like one thing that my children have done sometimes is they will ask one parent. If one parent says no, they go and they ask the other parent, to the point where my husband has gotten to the point where he just says, I don't know, go ask your mom. So we want to be sure that we uphold the same rules, so that it's predictable for everybody. And now the last thing I want to talk about is specific challenging behaviors. So if we talk about challenging behaviors, sometimes the definition depends a little bit on whose perspective is it. But really, the textbook definition is that it's behavior that interferes with children's learning and development and success at play and interactions with others. It can be behavior that's harmful for the children or others, and anything that puts the child at risk for later social problems or school failure. But again, at times it really is in the eye of the beholder, because our perspectives can change based on our attitude or our mood, based on previous experiences with the child or with that behavior, any kind of education and training. So maybe something that one person sees as a challenging behavior, another person thinks it's developmentally appropriate. That's so normal for children this age, or, he's just tired, so that's why he's doing that. So that can depend. But something to keep in mind is all children's behavior have a reason and a purpose. So what we need to try and do is identify the reason and the purpose. Oftentimes, common reasons for challenging behaviors are really just the child's developmental level. They might have a lack of understanding, impulse control, problems with self-regulation and emotions, not able to solve problems appropriately yet. Sometimes it's attention seeking, especially if children feel that they're not getting enough attention. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes any kind of attention could be better than no attention at all. And it could also be that their basic needs are not being met. If children are hungry, if they don't have adequate housing, if they're being bullied at school, if they don't feel safe, that can lead to challenging behaviors. And then it can be because the behavior works. If they throw a tantrum and then you finally give in because it's just so embarrassing to be at the grocery store when your child is on the floor throwing a tantrum, they learn that it actually worked. So what's going to happen next time is they're going to do the same thing, and they're just going to keep doing it until they learn that it doesn't work. So if we are looking at children up through age 3, challenging behaviors are considered developmentally appropriate because they're just not at a developmental level where they fully understand what they're supposed to be doing. Their memories are not fully developed. And so most children will outgrow it over time with the guidance and directions from their caregivers and the teachers. Um, Part of it is because they learn emotional regulation. They start to understand other people's point of view, can understand the perspectives of others and consequences of their behaviors. There's an increase in pro-social strategies, and then they're better able to communicate their needs. What we do find is in the United States, it's an estimated 3 to 15% of children that don't outgrow the challenging behaviors, which means that they continue these behaviors. These behaviors become more aggressive and antisocial as they get older. And part of the problem there is that they risk going into criminal behaviors, delinquent adolescent behaviors. And so it's really important to be aware what's developmental, what's learned behavior, and what's really something that we probably need to intervene at an early age. Because if they continue these challenging behaviors, it really impedes their social interactions with others. It can lead to exclusion and isolation, depression, not being able to hang out with other children, not being invited to birthday parties. And then it becomes this vicious cycle where then they feel more isolated and then they become more depressed. And so if we look at the roots of challenging behaviors, some of them are genetic. There are genetic predispositions for various mood disorders. It could be the unmet needs, such as lack of housing, lack of food, being excluded by children, lack of social skills. Sometimes it could be just a continuation of inappropriate parenting practices, such as giving in to the tantrums, or if parents are being abusive. But there are things we can do. There are protective factors. So if children are receiving support from their families, from their teachers, from good friends, if we have a protective social environment where we're continuing to encourage the pro-social behaviors, giving them age-appropriate responsibilities so that they can feel that they're being successful and so that they can be rewarded for good behaviors. And then consistency is key. A lot of times these challenging behaviors also happen because their environments are not predictive. Children really function better when there is structure in their environment. So one thing we want to try and do is kind of shift the balance if we're noticing more challenging behaviors, such as accepting their temperamental idiosyncrasies that they might have, and allow them to have experiences that challenge them but don't overwhelm them, so that they can learn to cope with certain amounts of frustration a little bit over time. To try to convey to them a sense of caring and responsibility. What we see is that children who grow up with pets, for example, and learn to take care of pets or learn to have certain responsibilities at home, what happens is that they learn to be helpful, to be cooperative over time, encouraging them to have a special interest, a hobby, and an activity that they really like, that can serve as a source of gratification and self-esteem for them. And then we really want to model by example this conviction that life makes sense despite any kind of adversities and barriers that we come across, because a lot of times that's what happens if they get so frustrated and they just don't know how to deal with it. And if they're being excluded by peers, if they have low impulse control, we want to still encourage them so that they don't spiral down to depression and suicidal ideation. We really have to pay attention to these continuous challenging behaviors and really intervene. And sometimes you might need professional help with that, but certainly really paying attention to children's behavior, because again, there is a reason and a purpose for their behavior. And so kind of to sum it up, There are a host of things that you can do to help guide your children, to help them on a positive path in life, to really teach them about rules and appropriate behaviors. But also just give yourself some grace and keep in mind there is not one thing that's going to work all the time. You're not going to be perfect as a parent all the time, but that's okay. As long as we can continue to be committed to helping our children, to guide our children, to be the best people that they can be, to really communicate with them, then you can really create a supportive and positive path for them. So I hope that this was helpful, and I hope you have a great day.
The Mothers Leading the Way team shares the goal of identifying the challenges and opportunities faced by working mothers with leadership ambitions. Through research, videos, blogs, and social media, our team is passionately committed to providing working mothers with resources to narrow the leadership gap. The Mothers Leading the Way project is supported by the Jane Nelson Institute for Women's Leadership at Texas Woman's University. This institute is dedicated to preparing more women to take on successful roles in business and public service by providing education, mentoring, and networking. Mothers Leading the Way is also supported by Positive Leadership. Positive Leadership is committed to empowering diverse women to maximize their leadership potential through workshops, presentations, coaching, and consultations. Check out Positive Leadership at positiveleadership.com.